Yeah, hello everyone. I'm also going to switch off my camera. Everything's been fine at my house for internet for a long time, and last night it dropped out for a few minutes, and today it's a bit slow. So just to save a bit of bandwidth, I'm actually going to turn off. I'm just going to turn off my video, but you should still be able to hear me, of course. So welcome to the Glasgow City Heritage Trust's Historic Glass CPD. Now, I'm not one to do a presentation with loads and loads of slides with text. So there'll be a minimal amount of text and lots of photos. What I want to do is impart information so that you can go and do your own research if it's relevant to a project or something. There might be a couple of a second delay on the slides as well, so bear with me with that. So no better way to start than with a statement which experience tells me a percentage of people disagree with, but I'm sorry to hear that. So what is glass? It's not a liquid. I've heard people say it's a liquid. It's not a liquid. It's an amorphous, non-crystalline solid, vitreous material. It's brittle, insoluble, and typically transparent. It's sand and other things. You melt them. You melt a bunch of solids and you end up with a solid. So glass making has been practiced for well over 4,000 years. There's strong evidence for it being found in the Middle East and so on. And there's, in Egypt, there's relief carvings of glass being made, which really hasn't changed a lot or didn't change a lot for thousands of years. It's very similar to the way they were doing it in making glass in the 1600s in Europe. Quite wonderfully, there's a text that I've used a lot for this presentation from about 1740. And they describe making glass. It's a building materials book. They describe making glass. And in it, the author says, in the 1600s, glass making in England, it's an English book, glass making in England improved dramatically when an English glassmaker studied in France before returning to England to make glass, which was superior to his masters, as is so commonly the way with Englishmen. So, coloured glass was desirable for decorative items. For normal windows, people wanted a clearer type of glass. Now, glass was often referred to, if you're reading about glass or researching about glass, you'll often see where glass is referred to by the region. In a lot of historic texts, for example, the 1700s books I've been reading, you'll hear it referred to as German glass, Newcastle glass, Dutch glass, London glass. But often you'll also see the glass referred to as the suburb of London that it came from. So glass is mostly sand. The high purity silica or silicon dioxide was what people wanted, so they could melt that. But not all sand's appropriate. A lot of sand has impurities in it, such as mica and feldspar. Mica and feldspar, you often see them in sandstone and granite and so on, the sparkly sort of reflective pieces. You get iron oxides and calciums, and these things can all affect the quality of the glass. And some sand's just totally inappropriate for making glass because it's largely calcium. Now, sometimes in these historic books, you'll see people criticizing glass makers in a geographical region, which probably wasn't fair. You know, it probably depended, a lot of it was probably influenced by the sand available to the glass maker. On the left here, you've got coccoliths, which make lime. They're little platelets, little skeletons that make limestone and lime that we burn for mortar. On the left-hand side, you've got foraminifera, which are from Japan. No, they're not suitable. None of this is suitable for making glass. Roman glass was very impressive at times. These were called cage cups for sort of self-explanatory reasons. And these were from about the 5th century. These are in the British Museum. There's only one in existence that's not broken. I think that's the one on the right there that's in the British Museum. Romans made glass, but think IKEA. They would make glass. It wasn't very clear. It was for letting light in. It wasn't for looking through as we would do. And they tended to pour them onto a dense anvil-like piece of metal, and that was like an early version of plate glass, not very clear. So glass making in Israel was known to exist around 800 BC. And in the 1950s, the slab of Beth She'erim was discovered. It was in a glass foundry. No one knows why it had been abandoned, but they basically, a glass foundry had been abandoned with this enormous slab of glass. They would make the glass. This weighs 8,000 kilos, by the way. They would make the glass, then break it up into smaller pieces that were sort of random in shape but manageable in size, and these would be sent all over all over the known world to them. And it was very similar here. The glass would be made in large scale often in France or Belgium or somewhere, and then sent here, where local people would melt it prior to it being made here on a large scale. The left-hand side is an example of a Roman window found in England, and the right-hand side is practical archaeologists using Roman instructions to make something similar, which looks very impressive, actually. Now, the different types of historic glass, there's many different types of glass, but the three types that people will come across the most are crown, cylinder, and plate. Now, there's some ambiguity, especially between the words plate and sheet. So crown glass is blown into globes, then spun into discs. Cylinder glass is blown into globes, then these are extended into long cylinders, which they sort of spin using centrifugal forces to stretch like a big balloon. Then they split them down the center and let them unfurl. And then plate glass, which is not sheet glass, was poured on to a large metal plate. So I'll just go through them. Starting with plate glass, it was the most common type, and it was historically, you can read in the 1700s or so on, they talk about it being the clearest type of glass. Made from sand and an alkaline, potash or soda, just what you would use for making soap. You could adjust the color for clarity with things such as arsenic, or not for cobalt, that should say, or cobalt. And there was 4 grades of clarity that they referred to historically. So there was a French author called Diderot. He didn't do drawings, although they often get called Diderot drawings. He was the author, not the artist. So this is a crown glass factory, and you can see the summary of the pictures there. They're showing the blowing of the glass and the spinning and so on. Now, crown glass was very well regarded from the 1700s until even possibly up to the 1950s. It was regarded for its clarity. And if you look at the photo on the right, you can see how clear the fella in the background is, where it only really becomes a little bit obscure around the perimeter of the disc. This is a manual from Edinburgh, the Crown Glass and Glaziers Manual from 1835. It was written and printed in Edinburgh by William Cooper, who was described as a glass cutter, glazier, and glassmaker in ordinary to the King for Scotland, which sounds a bit odd to our ears today. He has a lot of descriptions about making glass, and if you look at the next slide, apologies if there's a delay. At the next slide, you'll see a pink arrow pointing at someone spinning a crown glass disc, and the green arrow is someone putting the disc into a cooling oven where they would anneal it. So they'd make the disc and they'd put it in the oven and let it cool slowly over about 24 hours. It tries to prevent the glass from easily shattering. In 1815, the Crown Glass Cutters and Glaziers Assistant was printed, and it is hundreds and hundreds of pages of tables, not exceptionally interesting to us to read, but it has some interesting things in it, such as how you cut glass up. So glass became standard sizes, which sort of influenced partly the size of windows, because no point insisting that a window was a certain size when you couldn't get the glass, or you would have too many panes or lights, LED light, so the actual individual panes, you wanted them to match, so everything was sort of complementary to each other. And I have a theory about this. If you look at the crown disc, this one's 51 inches. I think they could be up to about 6 feet wide, but the crown here is about 51 inches, or it is 51 inches, the one on the left, 48 inches, the one on the right. Now, if you look where the pink arrows are pointing, you can't help but have lots of curved pieces that are curved on one side. Now, I have a feeling that they probably influenced the fashion of fan lights above doors and arch tops to sash windows and fixed windows and so on, because if you insist on square glass, you're not going to get a very big piece out of those. Whereas if you accept the curve as part of the production, you're going to be able to use those quite elegantly in a lot of cases for making windows. You can see here, there's this hundreds of pages of this talking about cost, about economy, almost like a QS, a quantity surveyors type book, as well as a seller's. Now, when you make a disc of crown glass, you end up with the bullion in the center. Usually the bullion is referred to as a bullseye. If you look at historic text, they normally call it a bullion. Now, it wasn't very clear. It's very difficult to see through. Vision's distorted. And there's this sort of, we all, apart from modern PVC front doors, which have a faux bullion, which is nice and smooth, we often talk about these being used only for poor people's windows or the back of workshops or whatever. That's not strictly true. I mean, here it's Falkland House near Cooper, just up the road from Falkland Palace, and they've used these to great effect. It's quite a dramatic effect. When you walk past it, it's not as dark as that room, that hallway is not as dark as the photo implies, but it's to great effect. And you can see the bullion. It's nothing like the sort of bullseye that you get in a modern PVC twee door. It's quite sharp. They could snap it off, or they could trickle a piece of molten glass over it to cut it. But you could cut yourself on these. They're quite sharp. So cylinder glass, there was a Frenchman, Mr. Goodtime. He came over and he taught local glaziers in the 1830s to improve their glass manufacture. The French were really the masters of glass at that point, so they say. So he dramatically increased the quality, or improved the quality of British glass, or English glass mostly it was, but British glass. So cylinder glass, you can see these two fellows here. On the left, they're starting, excuse me, they're starting in a sort of a standard glassworker's style of blowing a globe. Then that gets stretched and made into long cylinders with the ends removed, cut down the center and allowed to unfurl. And if they don't unfurl correctly, you can actually quite easily spot them in houses, and I've got an example of that. By the 1920s, they were making cylinder glass, but in a more modern way. They would just lower on a chain. They would lower a disc, a bit like a big rubbish bin lid or something, or a frisbee. They would lower that, touch the glass, and then just the chain would lift. I'm talking about the left side photo. The chain would lift up into the air, and as it did, the molten glass would be attracted by the slightly more solid piece of glass above it. So you'd actually just draw the glass out. And these could be up to about 10 meters in length. It's very impressive when you look at them. That was a standard way of making glass for a long, long time. Because back there, this cylinder glass was preferred over plate glass, and crown glass was preferred over cylinder glass for a long time. Now, if you look at these windows in Edinburgh, you can actually see quite a dramatic curve in it. You can't really mistake that easily for a disc of crown glass or for plate glass. It's a cylinder which is not unfurled correctly. Now, virtually all the types of glass, historically, you read references to the 4 types. You read references to, type 1 being perfect all the way to type 4, which was pretty cheap. So not so much used today, but that was historically, you'd see these references all the time. Now, plate glass was the poor cousin for a long, long time because it was not clear compared to the others. So plate glass is not sheet glass. Cylinder glass was sheet glass in the context of, oh, look at us, we've just made a big sheet of glass. Whereas plate glass was cast onto large metal plates, heavy metal plates. There's some details there about what was added to it. And here was the first full-blown plate glass. I shouldn't use the word blown, that's ambiguous. The first large-scale plate glass factory in the UK, I believe, in 1773. In England, it was the British Plate Glass Co. On the left-hand side was the molten glass. Then they would bring it over, they would pour the molten glass onto that table, which was on train tracks, more or less. Then they would push it to, once they'd done it, they'd push it to the right into the annealing ovens. Polished plate glass was a huge improvement. They had to develop the grinding and polishing processes so they could grind the glass to improve the quality. Once they did that, plate glass became the preferred type of glass. You can see here, this is in Pittsburgh in 1899. They're pouring the glass onto the metal plate. You can see it's molten. It's almost a bit like a rock or toffee, if you've ever seen a sweetie factory where they pour molten, not molten, but they pour liquid toffee onto a plate and stretch it. Well, it's a bit like that. So they're pouring the hot molten glass onto the plate. Then they're rolling it, which influences the term rolled glass. So they're rolling it smooth. There's two sets of people there using an initial roller, then a smaller roller. They get it flat. They can salvage some of the waste. Then here in this next photo, you've got all hands on deck mostly, basically, and they're using a bar, and they're actually pushing the sheet, which is quite impressive. They're actually sliding that sheet of glass into the annealing oven, or they referred to it as a storing oven. And you can see there's just, I don't know about dozens, but there's many in a row. So the process actually moved along the factory. This drawing's a little bit exaggerated, I think, but what they're doing is they're showing you that when the glass comes out of the oven, you cannot see through it very easily. They're trying to emphasize in this drawing that it's opaque. It's plate glass and it's opaque. So then it's sent off for grinding, which they did with various grades of sand. Once it had gone through the quite aggressive grinding process, it then went to polishing. So here they're trying to polish it. They explain to a satin finish. If it was a gloss finish, it would be annoying because there'd be too much glare. So they're just doing it to a satin finish so it's not a distraction. I've got a catalogue here from the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, which anyone in the US who's involved in glass knows about. They're huge. They talk about, they're bragging about how good their process is here, and it shows how times have changed. They explain that a third of the glass, as it's taken out of the annealing oven, a third of the glass is, the weight is lost. It's basically washed away down the river. And they explain here that over 2.5 million pounds, which I think is about 1 million kilos of glass a year, ends up in the river. I'm not sure that many large corporations would put that in their advertising literature these days. So here, their drawing of the glass, it's been polished. It's nice and clear. And they're emphasizing that. We're having some fellas in the background there that you can see. So they're talking about how their glass is nice and clear and ready for sale. Then in their catalogue, they've got this lady with, I hope she's got a corset on or not. And she's standing there showing you the sample of cylinder glass on the left and plate glass on the right. And it's interesting because the literature talks about how cylinder glass will always look dirty and you'll never be happy with it, and you should get plate glass and you'll be over the moon at how clear it is. You can see the attraction when you look at these two photos here. The one on the left is from about 1910. I think the one on the right is from 1900. They're both in Dublin, and you can see how the shopkeepers were keen to have ever larger and larger pieces of glass to get your attention. Next one here is in Ireland as well. It's Waterford. You got Mr. Mortimer there showing off his big window, and he's even got bananas, which is quite impressive. So this is 1916, and you can see he's got chocolates and looks like avocados or something he's got there. But you can see how the shopkeepers wanted to show off their wares. They didn't want, even though we look at these Georgian windows with small panes and we think they're twig and they're lovely and all of it, it's nice and everything. They didn't want that. They wanted the clients to be able to see as clearly as possible. And by the way, I don't have a photo, unless it's in the previous slide. I don't have a photo, but if you look at historic shops, you'll often see vertical splits, cuts in the woodwork frame above the glass. The reason was on the inside of the glass, near floor level, they would often, this is really quite dodgy, they would often have a piece of a piece of copper tube with gas in it, gas that was for the lighting, I guess, and they would light it. So you'd have a whole series of flames, like cigarette lighter flames on the inside of the room, maybe a dozen or so, imagine little cigarette lighter flames. They generate enough warmth to make the air rise, and that rising air would clear condensation off the glass, and the vents at the top were allowed to, as a way for the warm air, damp air to escape. But you do still see that. If you look at shops, you'll often see these little vertical lines cut into the timber frame. So we've come back to the 1920s. In England, at Pilkington, they've got opaque glass that you can see there. It's opaque. It's just come out of the annealing ovens. Here you've got a couple of guys on their wrists. They've got glaziers. I can't think what you call them, not gauntlets, but they don't cover the hands. They're only covering their wrists. So I've got a set of these, and glaziers use these today. The idea is that you don't accidentally cut your wrists on broken glass. So here these guys are looking for imperfections before they send it off to be polished, because polishing the glass, even in the 1920s, even though in 1899 in Pittsburgh they were doing mechanical polishing, here in 1920s, they're talking about how they're still doing some hand polishing, but they'd also had mechanical polishing as well. And in this next slide, they explain how they put the glass on lambswool. They use gypsum as an aggregate and they polish the glass. Now, this next slide is one of the most wonderful slides I've ever seen in reference to historic photos of tradespeople doing historic work. These guys are all standing on this piece of glass with their massive shoes, which might even be clogs. They've got gypsum under the glass and they're basically line dancing this huge sheet of glass around that massive metal disc. Now, if you've ever seen people make paint and they use a muller on a sheet of glass and they grind the paint pigments down into the oil, and that's how they made the paint. This is basically the same thing. So these guys would actually shuffle that glass across that disc. And it must have been an amazing thing to see. Once they'd finished shuffling that glass around, it went off for another final inspection. And they would make sure that there were no impurities before it went off. More so, I don't think for a minute they had 4 grades of shop glass, because your average shopkeeper, I imagine, wouldn't want 4th grade shop glass in his window because it was expensive. Just the transport alone was expensive. So I imagine that the shop fronts were slightly different. You can see here what appears to be a shop front getting sent off on a wagon in an early, around sort of 1915, I think this was, and it's getting sent off to a shop front. Here's an explanation talking about sheets of glass, cylinder glass this is, and they're talking about first quality, second quality, it's accepted in public buildings, third quality, suitable for most ordinary buildings and conservatories, etc. If you work, I'm assuming everyone listening today or watching this today has an interest in historic buildings. Some of you will have a professional interest. If you're writing a report or making recommendations and you're looking at buildings, just remember these things, these first, second, third, and fourth, and also the different styles. And the weights came into it as well. On the right-hand side here, there's some weights written down, the maximum sizes and their grades. What's interesting is I haven't got it in this, but I saw some information recently from the 1930s. Black vitrolite glass was heavier than other colors until it gets to a certain size, and then it becomes lighter. So things are often not what you assume, or things can sort of be a bit contradictory. It's just sort of, you know, I've said this before in other presentations, it's good to really understand what you're looking at before you write anything down or make statements. So thickness of the glasses vary dramatically from a few millimeters up to 1.5 inches here for floor and deck. So in 1920 something, they were putting glass floors in, presumably for touristy type looking things, but also probably in commercial situations as well. So you can see there, they have the sizes that they can go up to and the recommended uses. This photo here is a guy with a shop front. You can see on the right-hand side, there's quite an impressive range of curved glass available for shop fronts. And you can see here, he's using a very simple wooden template to move along the glass to make sure it's not warped or twisted, so it's going to fit in the frame. No point sending that piece of glass out if it's not going to fit in the frame. The frames were often bronze for expensive glass like this, so there's no flexibility. It's not like if it's a timber frame and you could just chisel a bit off and add a bit on and sort of tweak it to suit on the day if you're only talking about 10 millimeters or something. If that's a bronze frame, you're in strife. And I think from memory, the 2 shop fronts in the bottom picture there, I think they're bronze as well. One of the things that was quite dramatic in the 1850s was, as glass technology progressed, it let people do more and more adventurous things. And one of the greatest losses in the UK, as far as heritage buildings go, must be the Crystal Palace. It must have been absolutely unbelievable. When you look at the Crystal Palace, this is 10 years before, or more actually, before the American Civil War, I think. So, I mean, if you look at it, you put that in the context of the fountains as well, but just the sheer quantity of glass, the scale of that building in glass, that was incredibly brave. So it's very, very impressive, that. I said a moment ago about understanding things when you're looking at them. Now, if you look at this little conservatory and you think, I wonder how old it is, it appears to have leaded windows, the lead cames, the cames being the pieces holding the glass, and you've got a lead roof, and you would look at that and think it was older, not as old as not as old as it looks because of the building behind it. You think it looks quite old. It's a bit of a work of fiction. Here's a photo of the glaziers or joiners. They're dismantling it. So the one on the left with the diagonal boarding and so on, and the large panes of glass, is the original conservatory. This is from 1912. So there's the original conservatory. So they've done some modifications, and by the look of it, they've made it more stable, but also they've removed the bay, they've changed the roof, and they've used smaller panes of glass. So they're actually making it look much, much older than it really is. So whilst, usually when people do something, they make it bigger and more modern. Well, they've not. They've actually made it smaller and look older. So these are the sort of things you can get caught out when you make an assumption about how old something is. And like I said, it's something that's good to think of if you're putting these sort of things in reports or you're making recommendations. Here's an ad for British-made glass in Canada. Now, there's nothing really unusual about that, except you think, oh, well, wow, they were exporting glass to Canada. Obviously, there was a reason for it to do with supply and demand. But the bizarre thing about this, and some of you may have noticed the date already, 1941. In 1941, they sent 40 million square feet across. They're talking here, this ad's actually from 1942. So in the middle of World War II, they were sending hundreds of thousands of square feet of glass a year across the Atlantic, which was a theatre of war, to Canada. And when I read that and I actually checked the date, and the date's got 1942 all over the publication, and it talks about the war. So I thought that's just mind blowing. But that shows you the value and the importance of glass. They talk about Georgian mesh, which is quite interesting because older publications don't. Here we've got some tools. Now these tools on the left, this is from 1914, this catalogue. Those tools have hardly changed. You can buy those cutters now. Now on the left, you've got wheeled cutters. On the right, you've got what they call diamonds. So you'll often hear about a glazier's diamond. Now, the only bit that's the diamond is the pointy bit. You can see at those two that are vertical, you can see they've each got a diamond point. You can still buy diamond points. That is a diamond point. But also, sorry, I'm forgetting I've got a couple of seconds delay here for the picture, sorry. So here on the left is often called a diamond, but it's not, it's a carbide wheel. And I've got the one I use the ones like on the left. I like them, they're very heavy. The tube, the handle actually, that sort of hammer at the end, that brass end actually unscrews, you fill it with oil, which helps lubricate the blade as you cut. And also before you snap the glass, you can tap it with the end like a hammer. And that helps it fracture the glass and helps it separate more elegantly. These ones here that I just looked at, the little notches are for helping to nibble and break the glass. Nothing, you can buy these all today. If you look at the right-hand side, I've got glazier's pliers, and they're exactly the same as that. Apart from the fact they've got like a rubber type handle over the metal, they're exactly the same as that. And the round glass cutter isn't much different. I've never tried it, but I did actually see once a Victorian reference to putting holes in glass for pipes and that sort of thing and ventilation. And what they said was you could make a little dam of like linseed putty. So you'd make a little shape in the shape that you wanted cut out of linseed putty, and then you would pour molten metal into it, like an aluminium. Aluminium melts at about 600 degrees, 660, I think, Celsius. Aluminium melts at. So you could pour some aluminium in it. You could pour, it said lead, but lead's only about 375 degrees it melts, I think. But a lot of these glasses melted around 500 or 600. So I'm not sure if that was someone's theory they'd written down as fact, or if it was something that was commonly done, but it sounds very cool. Again, more tools from sort of pre-World War I, exactly the same as we use today, and some bulk containers of linseed putty. And there were many different putties. I've got a book from the 1890s, I think, and they talk about thermoplastic window putty. Not a modern term at all. They meant, what that meant was there was things in it, a bit like we would use butyl mastic today. There was things in it which prevented that putty from ever going very brittle. And they used it a lot, I believe, so the texts tell me, in greenhouses and things where you had, in places like that, where you had large fluctuations in temperature, which could affect the building and the glass. There's also recipes for accelerated hardening of glass, which would make the putty exceptionally brittle very fast. So they didn't just use one putty, they used many, many different types of putties. I think I saw a list of about 6 putties from the 1800s, late 1800s. Often you'll see, if you ever watched anyone, or if you've ever done it yourself, if you put glass in a frame, people often use a little nail or a little pin, brad, and they snip off the end or whatever. These are not new. This is a cross between a stapler and a spear gun. You put these little diamonds, call them, which have a lozenge shape, or they're triangles. I've got one of these. I think it's French. It's about 5 years old, and it's virtually identical to that one there on the that sort of point driver, they call it. Virtually identical, and they're fantastic. You get more coverage. You don't risk breaking the glass when you're hammering in, like you do when you're hammering in nails and so on. And they're very, very fast. So again, 100 more years and not much has really changed. As time went on, you know, there's a bit of a myth that someone builds a house or a tenement, and the sort of romantic ideal of the joiner making the windows, and then the joiner takes the windows to the building, and then the joiner installs them. It's largely a myth. If you lived in a large town or a city, by the 1850s, people were buying things from catalogues. And that included sash windows, elaborate windows like these for churches. Just think of how many churches they were building in the 1800s. You know, that you could buy any of these items from catalogues. I've got these catalogues. One of these is, I think the one on the left is from the UK, the one on the centre is American, and the one on the right is American or Canadian. I've got them from Australia in the 1800s, early 1900s. So people were buying these ready-made, ready-glazed sash windows quite often. They would take them to site, often remove the sashes, install the frame. I've got photos of stonework and brickwork being built around the frame, so there was no risk of breaking the glass. And then in the later stages, they'd come and reinstall the sashes into the frames. Same with stained glass. 1908, here's a catalogue here for the term stained glass windows. A disclaimer, I am not an expert in stained glass, and I make that very clear. My understanding is you have stained glass and coloured glass. Coloured glass is coloured, so if you snap it and break the glass and you look at it, it's the same colour all the way through the glass, whereas stained glass is more like painting the glass. So I've got some examples of that, and I hope I'm getting my terminology right. Actually, my great-grandfather was from Manchester, who emigrated to Australia in 1914, and he was on a ship that took a huge quantity of stained glass that he had been involved in making. His employer knew he wasn't coming back. They knew he was emigrating. So they said, well, you're emigrating, you may as well go out there and install it. And he installed, or was part of a team who installed a huge amount of stained glass in Melbourne, in a big cathedral there. And unfortunately, the war started and he was dead within 2 years of arriving. So we really don't, no one in the family really knows anything about him, which is a shame. So here's an ad from 1904, I think, or 1905, from an Edinburgh Gazette. And you can see here there's ads for glass stainers. So again, I'm talking about there's a difference between a factory who makes through coloured glass that people buy and then cut and then put into windows, etc., and people who would stain it. So I'm not actually 100% sure what other things. I imagine some of this wasn't just for windows. I imagine some of the stuff they did, based on other things I've read, was for decorative items and so on, furniture. A lot of often mantelpieces or more expensive pieces of furniture would have had coloured glass. So they probably weren't just restricted to windows. The ad below it, glaziers see merchants, glass painters and slaters, etc. There's a bit of a myth too, that in the old days, people only did one trade. I don't know if I should admit this, I'm a collector of Victorian invoices and things such as that. I've got a lot of invoices here, and you will often see the word jobbing. jobbing this, jobbing that, and a jobbing joiner, a jobbing, people had, jobbing was like day work, or it wasn't like we're doing all the masonry on this new cathedral. It was like, well, I'll do whatever. So you'd get the receipts and they would say, so-and-so joiner fixing a door, and the receipt would say fixing a door, putting some missing nuts and bolts on a cast iron bed, and having a key cut and replacing some glass. So there'd be like 6 or 7 things on the invoice which had nothing to do with each other, really. So people were multi-skilled back then, as the same way they're multi-skilled now. You've got glass embossers, then you've got glass manufacturers. Glass was expensive, not prohibitively expensive, and the whole glass window tax thing is totally blown out of proportion, but I don't want to get into that. That's a presentation in itself. Needless to say, I will just say that it's blown out of proportion. Window tax on the glass. Window tax was a tax on the middle classes who owned properties. It was not a tax. Peasants were usually exempt, peasants on farms and so on. Poor people paid for it indirectly, but they were only paying, you needed to have 8 windows or something, I think, before you got taxed, and they paid it in their rent. But I've got a book here somewhere on taxation in the 1800s, written in about 1880 or something, and they talk about how people's personal tax liabilities went up after the window tax was abolished. And people acknowledged that one of the big objections to the window tax was the intrusion of privacy for someone coming into your home more than the cost. So that's sort of been blown out of proportion. But glass was relatively expensive, and I've got some receipts. But here you can see an ad for insurance companies. And if I move my mouse over, hopefully you can see my mouse. Where is it? I've lost it. On here, there's 2 ads here. The British Crown Plate Glass Assurance Company. And there's another one further down near the bottom of the page, the glasses. So people took out insurance policies for their house, but they also took out separate policies for insurance of their windows. We've got about 10 slides left. So this is, I've left the title off, sorry. This is Falkland House near Cooper. It's just up the road from Falkland Palace. It's one of the most amazing buildings I've ever been in Scotland. Now, it has a lot of glass. It has a lot of decorative glass. Quite ironically, no one knows if it's tongue-in-cheek or not, but Oliver Cromwell, most of us are aware that Oliver Cromwell was not a fan of coloured glass, but in one of the rooms, there's actually some coloured glass, some stained glass with his name in it saying Lord Protect Us. So no one can tell me if it was a sincere salute to Cromwell or if it was tongue-in-cheek, because Cromwell did actually burn down Falkland Palace, several hundred years earlier. So I'm not sure. I've got a feeling it may have been tongue-in-cheek. But the glass in this building is just mind-blowing. And I've seen, I don't work on leaded windows. I have a sort of a passing knowledge of them. I'm in a lot of buildings that has them. And often I have to just write reports to say, well, there's this breakage and that breakage, and just record it to hand on to someone who knows a lot more than me about the subject. But something I've seen in this building, which I've never seen before, was 3D glass. If you look at that blue piece of glass in the center, it's not flat. It's faceted. It's cut like a diamond or a sapphire or something. It's cut, so when you looked at it, it's actually like a circle. And in other windows, there are round balls of glass put as features in the center, red and green, I think. So they're actually round like marbles. They're actually quite sizable, and I'd never actually seen that before. I don't know if that was a common thing. This is from the 1840s. I believe the glass is original from the 1840s. Here you've got what I believe is stained glass. So it's colored glass that's been painted over to create the artistic effect. Here you've got cathedral glass. That's not one piece of glass. That's a catalogue interpretation of the various pieces of glass they had for sale, and just showing you the styles. Figured glass. I'll just write a note so I don't forget to tell you something. So you've got figured glass here. You've got figured roll glass, then you've got cathedral glass. And there's different recommendations in the manufacturer's catalogues, depending on how much light you want to come through, how much privacy, and so on you want. I was reading something a while ago, and it talked about jealous glass. And I had no idea what they were talking about with this jealous glass. So I looked into it. It wasn't, I actually thought it meant jealous of the glass, so it must have been a high quality glass. What they were actually talking about was privacy glass, obscure glass. And they say in this book from 1740, I think it is, they talk about the benefits of jealous glass. This is what they're talking about. They're talking about figured glass. Now, you saw the previously when I showed you the 1899 Pittsburgh glass drawings of glass manufacture, and they were rolling it. Well, this is made just with a roller. So you would just have the glass. At that point, they would just roll it. So the descriptions tell me. Now, jealous glass was to give you an element of safety. You would put the jealous glass in your ground level windows, so that this was a Georgian thing, so that the criminals walking past your window couldn't look in and see all of your stuff that you'd paid for that they were jealous of and would steal. So it was basically just a privacy glass, and the whole purpose was to prevent people seeing your stuff, which is basically how they describe it. It's giving you an element of privacy to keep the jealous people out, which I thought was actually quite wonderful. It wasn't for bathrooms. A lot of people have asked this question in classes, and people say, oh, it's for bathrooms. Well, they didn't have bathrooms in the sense that we, in the 1600s and early 1700s, you know, they didn't have bathrooms in the sense that we think of a bathroom. It was an outdoor privy and so on. So it wasn't for privacy in bathrooms. It was for to prevent criminals seeing all your stuff. So they're talking here about the different sorts of glass. Clear cathedral, plain cathedral. And I'm not an expert in this range of glass, so I'm not actually, I'm not sure what small hammered cathedral glass is or large hammered cathedral glass. But the information is available if people need it for a project or something you're working on. Now, wire glass, they didn't really, this is from 1920, they didn't really talk about Georgian glass. I think Georgian wire glass was a term that came along when the glass started to have wire in it that was in squares. Now, the next slide you'll see isn't squares. It's showing you the glass like chicken wire. Now, you notice that there's a big increase around the turn of the century in fire. You were getting wooden floors, more so on the continent than the UK, but you get a lot of the technology for concrete floors like Hennebick and Monnier and these sort of Cognier, these people. They were retrofitting concrete floors into buildings that had previously had wooden floors. If you go around Europe, it's amazing how rarely you see wooden floors in large historic buildings. But glass as well. There was an obsession, rightly so, there was an obsession with safety and fire. They were obsessed with preventing fire. I think it's hard for us to understand how dangerous fire was 150, 200 years ago. So there's a lot of references to wired glass being preferred in a situation where there could be fire. Now, this guy has supposedly fallen through that glass roof. I think if you fell through untempered glass, tempered glass is what you get in cars. With safety glass, there's two types of safety glass. There's safety glass, which is laminated, which has a plastic film in between the glass, which is good for security. Because if people, you see, when people try to break the glass, it's not easy to break it. The other type of safety glass is laminated, like a car windscreen, so that if it breaks into small cubes that are less harmful than large shards. You can see shards above him. I think if this fella had fallen through a sheet of glass like that with those large shards, I think the least of his problems would be a broken arm. I think he'd be cut to shreds. So, but they're talking about how you can use wired glass. And in this photo here on the right-hand side, they've got polished wire glass. And you can see they don't mention Georgian glass. So I think Georgian was a term that came along when the wire was in square cubes or squares. I think it became known as wired glass. Sorry, as Georgian glass. Up till then, it was wired. Okay, so that was less than an hour for 70 and 80 slides. So I hope that didn't seem rushed, but there was a lot of information I wanted to impart. And like I said, I wanted to impart information so to give you an understanding of the different types of glass to allow you to do further research for relevant projects.